Calling S/4HANA APIs or other SAP APIs is probably something everybody's going to have to do from within SAP Build Apps. But it can be confusing dealing with all of the different CRUD operations or dealing with the nested entities that are part of these APIs. In this video, I'll show you the right way to call SAP APIs using business partner addresses as an example. The S/4HANA Cloud Business Partner API has a business partner entity with all types of nested entities, including business partner address. With nested entities, sometimes you simply get them as part of the main entity. For example, you call business partner and ask that the nested addresses be included. But sometimes you make a separate call to the nested entity. We will use both methods in our app. Most S/4HANA Cloud APIs work in a similar fashion, so this tech bite is designed to help you work with any of the APIs from within SAP Build Apps. We start with a destination to our S/4HANA system. So the URL is to the Business Partner API. We have some authentication, and we have the additional properties App Guider Enable, HTML5 Dynamic Destination, and Web ID enabled, which let it be used within SAP Build Apps. So that's what we need to begin with. And let's look at the app that we want to build. We're going to build a simple app with 3 pages. The first page will let us select a business partner. Then we'll get to the business partner addresses. So from a business partner, we will be able to click and see its addresses. And then we can click on one of the addresses and update it. Or we can click and say that we want a new address. So that's what we will build. So let's do it one by one. Let's open up the business partners page. All 3 of the pages we already have the UI built. And the first thing we need to do is to bring in our data. So we'll go to the data tab. And even before we go to the data tab, we will enable authentication to BTP. Just a few clicks, and now it's enabled. And now let's go to the data tab and make a connection to our destination. So we'll search and we'll find our destination. We will install this integration, and we want to make use of 2 entities. First, the business partner entity, so we'll enable that, and the business partner address entity, which we will enable. But with the business partner address, we also want to get the nested entity address usage so we can know if it's the default address. So we will expand the to address usage field. And that's all we need to do. We'll save it. We'll go back to the page. So the first thing we need to do is to create a variable. So we'll create a data variable based on our business partner data resource. We will filter it. So I only want to bring back certain things with a search term equal to DBW, my initials. I suggest that you always filter or page the data so that you don't bring back 10,000 records at a time. We'll go back to the page. We'll take our list item and we will repeat it with the data variable. Then we will bind the data to our list item. So for the first one, we will, for the primary field, we will use the, it should be data item in repeat when we're repeating. And the first one is business partner full name. And the secondary label will be the business partner ID. Whoops. See, if you use the data variable, you get an error, but if you use the repeat, everything is fine. And then we have the business partner. And the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to click any business partner and see its addresses. So we will just say to open a page. And we will navigate to the business partner addresses page. And for that, we need to supply a business partner. So we will go to datum item and repeat and provide the business partner ID. Now if we test it, we see that we get all of our business partners. And if we click into one, we go to the business partner address page. But we haven't set up the business partner address page, so we don't see the results yet. So that's all we need to do for the first page. Let's open up our business partner addresses page, our second page. And the first thing we need to do is to create our data variables. So we will create our business partner entity, and we will create a data variable for the business partner address. For the business partner, we want it to be a single record, and therefore we want to specify the business partner ID, which we get in the page parameter, which we set up before we started this video. And for the business partner address, we only want the addresses for a specific business partner. So we'll filter based on business partner, and we'll set it equal, again, to the parameter. And we'll save, and we'll go back to the page. Now in the page, we want to bind the address data variable to the container that contains the list item and the delete button. So we will set the repeat to the data variable for address, and it will show us all the addresses. Now we want to bind the primary label of the list item, which will be based on the house number and the street address. So since we want to combine a couple fields, we'll need a formula, and we'll make that the house number plus the street name, assuming the street name exists. So we will save, and the secondary label will be the name of the city. So that will get in the data item for repeat, and we'll look for the city name. Now we have three pieces of logic that we need to define. One is the new address button, one is the delete icon, and one is if we click a specific address in order to update it. So we will start with the delete. And the first thing we want to know is if the address is the default address. If it is, we are not able to delete it. So we want to check that. So we come in here with an if condition, and we ask, is the address usage field equal to XX default? Because that is the key that determines if this is the default address. Now, the reason we can get it is that we expanded the address entity to include the to address usage nested entity. So we get that. You'll notice that it's in red because currently the nested entities are not part of the schema, but fortunately you can save the formula and it will check those values. So that's the first thing we need to do. If it is the default, we want to alert people that that's the default, so we'll add an alert. And we will put some sort of message that says you cannot delete the default address. But if you can delete it, we want to add a delete record flow function. So we will delete the record, and we will specify that we want to delete something from the addresses, and we will specify the business partner from the page parameter, and we will specify the current address from the data item in repeat, the address ID, and now we've deleted it. Now once we've deleted it, we want to refresh the data, so we will again add a get collection. And we will ask for all of the addresses again, but specifically for this business partner. So we will add a condition again to the business partner, and that's in the parameters. And of course, now we need to set the data variable. From the output of the get record collection. My fault. We want to set the addresses data variable, and now we'll be able to set it from the output of the get record collection. And we save it. And just to complete things, we will add an alert box. In case something happens, we will take the output from the delete record and we will display the message. Now let's deal with the address and clicking the any specific address. So for the new address, all we want to do is we want to go to the page where we can enter the fields for the new address. And we want to go to the address details, which is fine. And we want to specify that which address ID. So here we don't need an ID because this is a new address. We do need the business partner, so we will take that from the parameters as always. We can provide the business partner name from the from the data variable. So we have business partner and we have the full name. And here we want to specify whether this is the default address. So we go in and we have a formula and we check that expanded entity. I'm sorry. We don't have the expanded entity, but we check whether this is the first address or not the first address. If it's the first address, then it will be the default address. If it's not the first address, it will not be the default address. So we only check how many addresses this business partner has. If it's 0, we say it's default. And if it's not 0, we don't say it's default. And the last thing we need to do is to define what happens when we click one of the addresses. And again, all we want to do is to open the page. Address details. But this time we do want to provide the address ID because it's for a specific address. We do need to provide the business partner ID. We can provide the business partner name from the data variable. I always use the full name. And we don't need to worry about whether it's the current address, the default address or not. It is the address that it is, and we don't need to update that field. So if it's the default address, it will remain the default address. And if it's not the default address, it will remain not the default address. And that's all we need to do for the second one. Let's test it. Let's go to the consolidated tours. We can see the list of addresses. We have a formula that will show which one is the default address. I will show you that in a moment. We have a new address that clicks to the next page and opens up a form. Or if we click a specific address, it also opens up the form. It doesn't show the values yet because we haven't set up this page. If we go back to the form, we can go to the container and we can go to the style, and we've set up a local palette for this background color, and it's a formula. So the formula says that if the address usage is empty, meaning it's not the default address, then we provide no color, meaning it's transparent. But if it is the default address, we provide a color, and so therefore when we have a default address, it will be clear to us which one is the default address. Now we will go to our third page, which is our form to either create a new address or update an old address. So here we are creating a single form, whether it's a create or an update, but we'll have to do a few things to set it up so we can handle both things. Basically, what we need to do is to set up our data variable and to populate it with appropriate data. We'll see that in a moment. We need to bind the fields, the input fields, and we need to provide logic for the save button. So the first thing we'll do is we will create the data variables. And in fact, we only need, whoops, that's an app variable. We only need one, which is the address. However, we need to set it up in a particular way. So the first thing is to say we want a new data record, which basically means we want a blank variable, okay? And generally speaking, with no data in it and no API calls. But we will actually make this, we will provide special logic here. So the first thing is we want to know whether this is an update or a create. So the first thing we do is we add an if, and we say, is the address ID empty? So the condition will be based on a formula. And we ask, is the address ID that was part of the page parameter empty or not? If it's empty, it's a create. And if there is an ID, it's an update. Okay, so now we know. The next thing we say is, if it's an update, we want to get the data for that record. So we will get record, and we will get the address, provide the business partner, as always from the parameter, and in this case, the address ID is also from the page parameter. Now we have the record, and we want to set our data variable. So we come here, and we set the data variable. But we don't want to set all of the values, because it's very finicky, the API. So if you provide blank values for certain fields, it won't like it. So we only want to provide the fields that we want to provide. So we will provide a formula, and that formula will say that we want to take the fields that we retrieved for that address, but we only want to put the following records into our variable. Okay? We want the house number, the city name, the country, and the street name. So we use the pick keys function to take only those values from the get record flow function. And that's what we need to do. But if it's a create, we need to set our variable, right? We don't need to retrieve anything, but we need to set it. And it's the address. And what we want to do is only set the values that we know. So again, we'll use a formula. And instead of all four values, we'll just set the address ID and the business partner ID. So it's all ready for any data that we want to add to it later on. And finally, we have to deal with if it's a default record. And here's where we can add nested data into this variable. So the first thing we do is to say, okay, is this a default address? and we check the page parameter that we send in. So if it's empty, it's a create. If it's empty, it's not a default address. But if it's not empty, it is a default address, and we have to add additional nested data in there. So we will add another set data record. And we will use a formula. And this time we will use the set key function, which will not disturb any of the data that's in there already, but will only add additional data. And here you can see that we add the toAddressUsage field, which is a list of parameters. And the most important thing is address usage. And in this particular case, we will make it equal the default. So we will save. And that is the logic for setting up our data variable. So we'll come back here. The next thing we need to do is to bind our fields. So we will bind the house number. This has already been done for us. All of these fields have been bound to the variable. So that is done. And the last thing we need is the logic for the save. Now, as you can imagine, in order to do the logic for the save, the first thing we need to do is to figure out, is this a create or an update? So we have an if, and as always, we use a formula to check if we have passed an address ID. If we have, then it's an update. Otherwise, it's a create. So if it's a create, we'll put this here. And if it's an update, we will put this here. Now, since we set up our data variable, all we need to do is specify that we want to update the address and that the record is coming from our data variable. And the same thing with the update. We want to update the address and the record is coming from our data variable. But with the update, we have to specify which record we want to update. So we have to supply the business partner from the page parameter and the address ID from the page parameter. Now, once we create or update the record, we want to come back and navigate back to the previous page. So we will navigate back, and it really doesn't matter from which one we've come. And we want to have an alert message, either one, that displays a message in case something fails. So now we can test it. And if we go to something that has addresses, we can delete this one. Try to delete the default one. You can see that it won't be deleted. Now we can try to add an address. So we'll say 1 First Street, New York, US. Save it. And you can see that it's added. We can try to update this one. I put in an alert box just to see. We can change it to 2. We can even update the default one. Make it 12. We can go back to an address that doesn't have any. So let's go to Accenture. Let's create a new address and say 100 Central Street, Central Avenue, Yonkers, US. Let's save it. And you'll notice that it's now the default address. And if we try to delete it, we can't delete it. I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching, and please leave a comment down below.